All the mixed messaging about masculinity these days, where do you suspect this generation of young men will land?
It is anybody's guess, and nobody really knows. And everyone is trying to move the needle in directions that are productive and generative, and hopefully also egalitarian, because it is the Wild West out there. I could not have guessed when I started working in this field as a grad student a little over 15 years ago that we would have a manosphere, that there would be figures like Andrew Tate that are being admired and imitated by millions of these adolescent boys in the way that he is, which is why I can't honestly make a good guess about the direction that we're headed in and what things will look like 15 years from now.
Given all the mixed messaging about masculinity these days, where will the next generation of young men ultimately land? My guest today is Neil Shyminsky, better known as Professor Neil. He is wildly popular on TikTok as well as across social media for addressing cultural misunderstandings on a variety of hot topics. Neil Shyminsky is a professor at Cambrian College, and his work on superheroes has been published in journals across the world. On today's podcast, we're talking about the impact of mixed messaging on healthy masculinity for the next generation, as well as the history of the Manosphere. The Manosphere, for those who don't know, is a broad collection of websites, blogs, and online forums claiming to promote masculinity, misogyny, and an opposition to feminism. Communities within that manosphere include everything from men's rights activists to incels to pickup artists and fathers' rights groups. While the specifics of each group's beliefs sometimes conflict, they are generally united in the belief that society is biased against men due to the influence of feminism and that feminists promote a hatred of men. Neil is one of the louder and more trusted voices in that fray, trying to promote healthy masculinity, and that battle brings its own very special set of challenges. It seems to me like it's always been clear that the healthy parts of traditional masculinity were honor, purpose, and self reliance. Nowadays, the cultural perception has morphed more towards dominance and control. When do
Mhm.
you think that happened?
Oh, certainly not all at once.
Mm.
Um, and in phases, if we want to look at sort of the modern origins of this movement, um, it begins back in the 70s. Um, and so that's the time at which a men's movement emerged in the United States and Canada. Um, the ironic thing about the men's movement is that it was started by the allies, the partners, and even male activists in second wave feminism, who wanted to give men purpose and common cause and address the problems of men in the same way that feminism was doing for women. And so they would go on retreats into the forest where they would get in touch with their inner masculine and find divine purpose, commune with other men. Um, but you can maybe already recognize that, hey, that sounds something like what these Andrew Tate type figures do, where they get a bunch of guys together, and we talk about what it's like being men and how it's difficult to be men and what can we do together to overcome these difficulties. In the 70s, that was coming from a very well-intentioned place, and by the time we reached the late 80s, it had already started to transform into more of this men's rights movement, where despite the good intentions of those male identified feminists in the 1970s, it had turned into the problem is not my inability to tap into some sort of primal masculine energy. Um, the problem is that women are getting in the way. Women have taken something from us, and we have to get it back.
So many things began from a strong, positive intention place, and then they just get completely bastardized, right?
For sure. Yeah, yeah.
It's
And
fascinating.
yeah, this is no different. I don't um I don't begrudge anyone who holds doubts whenever I open my mouth and I'm talking about either feminism, being an ally to the LGBTQ community, anti-racism, and they want to take stock of what I'm actually saying and whether they can actually trust me.
Mhm.
Precisely for this reason that we have so many examples of people who appeared, and maybe in fact they were totally sincere in their intentions, in their goals, um, and then at some point you stop and realize that whatever they were professing to be, if it ever was the case, it certainly isn't the case any longer.
Well,
Um,
first of all, I love your soundbite. I don't begrudge anybody who doubts me whenever I open my mouth. I should use that. Anyway, sorry, go on. I had to
No,
interrupt.
no, no, no. That's totally. It's hey, I'm when people point things out like this, 'cause I'm like, wow, I that wasn't even something that I meant to say. But you're right, that does sound like a good soundbite. Um, the
Can we take a step back? So you're an
sure.
English professor. You were a
Hmm.
PhD student in social and political thought. You had an MA in English, and then your research focused on the study of gender and popular culture, especially superheroes.
Hmm.
How did you wind up here? What else would you be doing if this wasn't where you were, right? First question, what else would you be doing?
Oh, there are a lot of we were talking earlier. Um, I can no longer remember whether this was before or after you hit the record button, but about how I remind you of your friend who's a lawyer. That would have certainly been a possible avenue for me. I was a debate club kid.
Wow.
Um, I still don't really know how to back down from arguments. So that's like my major personality flaw.
Can we dial in your wife for the counterpoint? Is she going to back that up or is she going to say no? Is she?
You know what? My wife would actually say, "Oh no, like that I don't go picking fights. That she's the one that picks fights.
Oh,
That I'm the conciliator." Um, you know, professional me is very different from personal me.
okay.
Um,
All
and
right. That makes sense.
yeah, I
Boy
have
and a girl?
two girls. I have a 15-year-old
Or-
and a 20-month old.
Oh, wow. That's
So
a big issue.
going big age gap. I think perhaps not surprisingly, I have been married twice. I have one daughter with each of those partners.
Mhm.
Um, yeah, uh, I'm not sure whether I just my brain elected to forget how difficult it was the first time, or whether this time truly is that much more difficult. I'm certain that I got more sleep the first time around. My
Really?
and Yeah, and this younger one just does not like it when she's not being held.
I don't like it when I'm not being held. I'm not happy right now that I'm not being held. So that's not, I can't, I can relate with her on that. But back to the topic. I went on
Sure.
Google this morning when I asked the AI, what is healthy masculinity? Have you ever done this?
Uh, you know what? I don't know that I have it. What is Google's answer
What
to
is
this
Google
question?
saying, right? So, what Google AI told me this morning is it said healthy masculinity is a concept that encourages men to embrace a wide range of emotions and values and to reject the idea that there is a single masculine way to be. It's about being yourself and overcoming societal pressures that limit how men are defined. If you insert the word woman and feminine in there,
Hmm.
you could say the same thing about healthy femininity. So
Hmm.
essentially, I am more confused now, right? I don't know why people are so afraid to say healthy traditional masculinity is generally seen as being about confidence, a spirit of service, and keeping your word. I don't think they're not feminine traits, but God, boys are looking for direction. The culture wars have made it almost impossible to devise a universal definition, and now even Google AI is failing us. Do you have
You,
a definition?
you know, I
Healthy
like
masculinity. Yeah.
yeah, I like that definition that you read quite a bit, actually. I do. And you know what? I offer certainly as my reflexive definition, like somebody's like, break it down for me in 50 words.
Okay.
I would say something very similar. And I have had people respond then, um, wait a minute, it sounds like you're just describing how to be a good person then. And I'm like, yes, exactly. Um, there is no reason that women can't possess the traits that you've described as being associated with positive traditional masculinity. Just as there's no reason that men can't take on roles that have traditionally been associated with women. But I do think that you've made a great point here, about how there's a very large divide between that definition, which I think is lovely, and how do I use that definition, um, to mobilize people to move myself forward, because it is difficult. We find comfort in being assigned roles,
Hmm.
um, in having purpose.
The categories make people feel comfortable, but they also get dangerous. You
Sure.
know, you talked a little bit. I've been looking at some of your older posts, and you talk a little bit about masculinity being aspirational.
Hmm.
Can you tell me why you compare idealizing masculinity? This is what I remember, idealizing masculinity to idealizing baseball.
I like to use this anecdote of a baseball writer, Joe Posnanski. But he would interview people to ask them, at what moment, was baseball perfect? Baseball fans he's interviewing. Um, he said what normally comes out is, they describe, the moment that they were 12 years old. It was perfect in this year with this team with this player. And he actually notes, uh, or suggests rather, that it's around the same time that they also, last thought that their parents were infallible, that their dad was always right, and in fact that politicians were good, that teachers had all the answers. So this moment where, the everybody was embodying the assigned roles, um, to perfection.
And Santa was real.
Yes, all of this, right? I mean, we could go in more cynical directions too.
Right.
Um, my first thought when you said incentive was real, and I was like, what? When did I stop believing in God? Was I 12? Um, but yeah, the world that you had been, taught existed by your parents, had not necessarily been interrupted yet. Um, and masculinity offers, or I should say, that the kind of masculinity that is being offered to us, um, for instance, by people in the Manosphere, is that same sort of reassurance. What I described at times as aspirational. Um, that there is this perfect world order, um, and there's just this laundry list of things that you need to do and you need to be in order to see it realized. Now, of course, that laundry list can never be completed. We will never actually hit, all of the milestones, all of the targets that they've laid out. Um, but they will always have their followers chasing them. It's also why I like to say that, the Manosphere and these online communities men operate a lot like a multi-level marketing scheme, um, precisely because, that that competition to achieve masculinity, first of all, is never ending. Um, Most people who attempt it will lose,
Hmm.
um, and because it is aspirational, um, it's constantly feeding off of the anxiety that is associated with that failure to capture um, the feeling that you had when you were 12. We're never getting back that certainty. We can't will ourselves to believe in Santa again. It's not going to happen.
Right. It's almost like what you're describing is chasing fame as well.
Mm,
This idea of creating a multi-level marketing scheme where everyone has to keep aspiring and aspiring and aspiring, and even when they reach it, it's
hmm
going to be momentary because you have to keep fighting to stay there and to embody all of these traits, and it's very one dimensional. What do you think we can do to free our boys of that one dimensional idealization sooner rather than later? Because 12 to me sounds late.
mm. I mean it. Unfortunately, it is right. Before I come to that, addressing that question, I just want to say, speaking specifically to 12 seems late.
Mm.
Um, I remember attending the graduation ceremony for my oldest daughter when she was graduating from eighth grade. There was a slideshow projecting onto the wall. Each of the kids had their graduation picture, and there were some fun facts on the slides too. One of those being a favorite inspirational quote,
Mm.
and I took note of how many times the boys were quoting Andrew Tate.
Oh God.
And
Okay.
there were
It's
four
gonna
of
hurt.
them.
Okay,
You
it's
know,
gonna
it's
hurt.
not
Hit
an
me with it.
overwhelming
See what I did there? See what I
not
did
an
there?
overwhelming number. You used it perfectly. Um, just four of them. Um, but that's enough
Yeah.
to make me think like it's not only those four boys, right?
There
Who
were the four
are
that
watching
surrounded
him
it.
and listening to him.
Mhm.
Four are selecting the quotes, but that's just indicative of a much larger number who are surely fans of his, who are idolizing him. So yeah, 12, 13, the he's already reached them. They're already drinking that Kool-Aid.
Sometimes I think it would be really simple, and we could solve this for the young boys if we said no phones, no video games, no nothing until you are 18. And we went back to the way that I grew up, where a boy had to pass you a note in class, see if you responded like two boxes. Do you like me? Yes, no,
hmm
And then if you said yes, it meant that he could walk you to class. He could walk you, he could hold your trapper keeper because I'm a million years old, right? And as long
Yeah,
as it.
and I totally appreciate that sentiment. I mean the flip side to that, I never want to um, vilify, you know, technology. I feel like I would be a hypocrite, given how much time I spend just existing online. Um, you know, another thing that I like to say is they're attractive because they offer very simple answers to the problems that are out there. So simple, I would suggest that they are effectively useless for most people.
Yeah,
Because what does Andrew Tate have to offer other than um, hit the gym, make millions of dollars, get bitches?
right.
How
Okay.
achievable is that for
Mhm.
anyone? Let's leave aside whether it's desirable. Um, how many people can actually do what it is he is suggesting they do? Alarmingly few. Well, maybe not alarming because we don't actually want people to be like him. Um, but it's not a realistic model for success.
And we don't want our 12-year-old boys aspiring to it, even if it was realistic. But these are the heroes that they find when they look for examples of masculinity, which brings me to something else you did. For a decade, you moderated the largest XMen message board on the internet.
hmm
So we're talking about heroes. We're talking about things to aspire to. What did you learn by moderating that message board about men, about boys, about what they're looking for?
You know what? That decade was, if I'm remembering it correctly now, I think it was from the time that I was 15 to 25.
Wow.
I learned a lot. I think that my time spent moderating that message board um, actually is responsible for a lot of what I've come to think about the world and our problems.
Mm.
You know, the one thing that I noticed that came out is, the X-Men, certainly when we're talking about before the time that they were in movies, um, attracted a lot of self-professed weirdos. A lot of we were talking about, kids that don't fit in, kids that are outcast. It was a lot of that type. Um, now, what started to rub me the wrong way a little bit is that these were overwhelmingly um, white boys, straight, middle to upper class, because comic books tend to appeal to people who have disposable money. Um, and that's all well and good. They were also nerdy, socially awkward. Um, and they saw themselves in the X-Men and in mutants. And I just for anybody who is following along who's not all that familiar with the X-Men, and maybe your exposure is Wolverine and Deadpool. Um, in the narrative, the X-Men are a violently persecuted and oppressed minority, belonging to this community of mutants, who are genetically different, and arguably even a different species than are other human beings. And I could already see, as a teenager, um, the danger in these straight white upper and middle class boys who are nerdy and awkward, um, seeing this persecuted minority and saying, like, oh, just like me. That is just like my experience.
Hmm.
And I, at some point, took a step back and was like, wait, what? It, it is it? Is that
Hmm.
is that our experience? I was also a little nerdy guy. I shot up like 10 inches in a year in high school. Went from being the smallest boy in the class to one of the tallest. Um, and when I was that little comic book nerd, I sure felt oppressed too.
Hmm.
Um,
But it can change in an
I
instant.
It can change, and I just grew out of it.
Yeah, I went from
Uh,
being bullied and having practically a mustache to being super popular and going out with the captain of the football team. Life is complicated, okay?
yeah,
I
yeah.
discovered eyeliner and it was over, right? So, but I do think there are a lot of kids these days who don't have that opportunity to figure out that life can change in an instant, and you
Mm.
are not typecast at 12. And I don't know if this is where you're going, but is it sort of the idea that identifying and getting clustered around being outsiders preempts your ability to figure that out?
Well, there's more than one lesson to draw from this. This is
Mhm,
certainly one, particularly when we're talking about a period like puberty,
mhm,
um, where yes, it's a transitional phase,
mhm.
and getting locked into that feeling is not certainly not healthy for anyone. Um, but as well in this situation, and this is what I see happening in the Manosphere too. Um, there is just a willful blindness to the many privileges that we also have, because you're just looking at that football team captain, um, that aspirational figure, that you admire and probably hate simultaneously, and noticing
It's
that you
both,
fall
yeah.
short there without taking a moment to evaluate where in fact you may reside in the grand scheme of things, and not noting that you have access to finances that other people do not. The privileges that simply come with, being a boy in this society.
Mhm.
Um, and instead saying, no, I am just like these characters that I see being run into camps where they're being murdered, and it's like, no, no,
No, you're
no,
not.
no, you're not.
Nope.
Let's okay, we need to take a second here. Let's get real. Um, but that, unfortunately, the rhetoric preempts those discussions. To listen to them talk, you would think that men are in fact being rounded up and tossed into camps.
You really would. Yeah, and I mean, I think it seems to me like the conclusion is that early on you figured out there's a real danger in identifying too soon as an outsider,
Mm,
and holding that as a big part of the core of who you are before you have a chance. Because I mean, life is about going out and figuring it out. I think there's a whole generation of, by the way, boys and girls who are having real trouble losing at life. But you have no problem going out with this lens of compassion, right? But the world is full of people who do. And so I came across something interesting. It was an article in Hook. Miriam Zenter, she's a psychologist at Exeter University specializing in gender bias. She drew sort of an important distinction between the idea that women's progress is hurting men and the idea that men are nonetheless suffering from the norms of masculinity still being imposed on them. And both of those things can be true, right?
mm,
She sort of points out that when male groups get together, they punish a member for being perceived as too feminine or not sufficiently masculine in all of the negative ways. And what she says is sexism as a system might benefit men, but gender discrimination means they are not allowing themselves anymore to experience their full humanity and emotions. This is bound to affect in the long term men's personal relationships the most. And what that means is all relationships. That's what I'm really concerned about. But the idea is that before the age of 10, most boys have relationships, friendships that are as close as the girls do. They are as close to their best friend as the girl in their class is to their best friend. They lose that friendship and then they get it back never. That level of closeness between boys, between men, between people who identify that way is over before 10, and they are alone for the rest of their lives. No matter how many friends they have, they've never experienced that closeness again. And so, my question is, everyone's trying to be careful with their language, everyone's trying to show compassion. At the same time, boys need both. They need to both understand that sexism has benefited them, but they also need to understand that while not apologizing for systems that they did not put in place, they have to be able to hold space. And that's a delicate balance, even for grown men to walk, much less 9-year-olds who are trying to have a crush on someone, for example, right? Do you
sure.
think the pendulum has swung too far?
Do I think the pendulum has swung too far? No. Um, and I think in part because there isn't just one pendulum. And I think we could hear that in the question or the questions that you were asking there. We have a lot of moving pieces. There was a comment in there, and maybe I'll just try to like pull on some separate strands and see where that leads us. Um, there about boys are and men need to hold space, but also they benefit from this system that it's not their fault. It's not my fault that I was born into a system that assigns me certain privileges. Um, but another, try to come up with the catchy quotes where we can.
Mhm.
Another one that I like to use is, "It's not our fault, but it is our responsibility." Um, so let's move past assigning blame, and instead look at the work that needs to be done. because if not me, then who? Um, because if it's not me, then every other man will be able to say, well, it's not me either. So I'm hoping to provide that sort of model and to encourage that sort of ethos. Because you know the there was sort of a very specific point that you're making about loneliness as well there. It can also be lonely to be operating in this space.
Mm.
There have been times where I felt like, I am the only man um, who speaks this way, who cares to address some of these issues. Um, but my hope is that there is somebody else out there uh, who is encouraged by seeing or hearing me to join me in that work. And I know that those people exist, and I know that they have responded that way because they've reached out to me to tell me that. And there is at least one other man on Instagram who makes videos that are quite similar to mine. Um, who sent me a message at one point to say, the reason that I do this is because you and the speech prof were
Oh,
making
yeah.
these videos, and I was inspired, and I realized that I had some work to do. Because he's like, when I started watching your videos, he's like, who is this asshole, and why is he calling me out? And then he's like, but I kept watching, and I didn't know why I kept watching because it made me angry. And then I realized that, like, oh, it pisses me off because he's right. Um,
That's
and
satisfying.
oh, it's
Oh,
very, very satisfying. Yes, especially because it's the people who are angry who are most likely to comment at times.
yeah.
Um, and this also I think connects back to that friendship piece because you're right. That sort of the vulnerability that's necessary to form deep friendships is something
Mhm.
that we are taught to suppress. That's weakness, and you can't show weakness um, to people who are out there being taught to compete, to be the aggressor, to dominate. As you said earlier, that domination
No
is
weakness.
powerfully associated with masculinity as well. And how can you open yourself up to somebody when you are also meant to be dominant, displaying dominance at all times? And that's one of the nice things that I've gotten out of this community. It's a micro community, but it's a community nonetheless online of men who speak to masculinity, to healthy masculinity, um, because we do talk to each other all the time. Um, and it's great to compare notes and also to just check in on each other,
Mm.
um, because we share this funny little experience.
Well, and I was going to ask you, what is the most challenging part of masculinity for you personally, the way that you express it in your life at this moment? Now I think it's um, probably the way people respond, right? It's got to be a lot.
It's it can be. This is actually one of the conversations that we have in these virtual spaces among
Mhm.
content creators, and this is common among content creators. Period. Uh, is that we start to go numb to the negative feedback because there is so much. There's so much feedback. Period. Um, but even when it's in the minority, the the bad stuff can be so bad that
Mm.
if you did not just shut it out, it would be difficult to get out of bed some days.
It's that bad.
Oh, terrible, terrible.
What is the tough part?
Oh, it's a little bit of everything. Um, there have been, funny enough, I have received multiple physical threats, but they are never physical threats against me.
Mm.
Um, they are threats against my family. Uh, as if, my pet theory here is that the people making these threats realize um, that, if they were to threaten me, uh, then that in some way would empower me. Because it would be a meeting of masculine men. They regard me in some way as an equal.
Mm.
But to
Mhm.
target, my daughter, for instance,
Wow.
um, is a very different thing.
Challenging you versus threatening to hurt someone you love. I mean, that's a really good distinction.
Yeah, I was joking with one of these friends online, and I said, "How often do you think we're getting these because somebody's girlfriend or wife sent them our video passive aggressively to say, like, didn't say this is you, just shared the video,
Right,
and
right.
they decided to take it out on us." And he's like, "Oh, I think that is 99% of the time."
Well, listen, and I think creating healthy spaces, safe places for healthy masculinity is very important. What you're talking about is another phrase you would use, compensatory masculinity,
Hmm.
right?
Hmm.
Doubling
Absolutely.
down when the masculinity is threatened. And that's basically what's happening when people are attacking you.
Oh, sure.
Oh,
Yeah. Yeah. As if, upsetting or angering us uh, will right that imbalance. They can assert their masculinity, and maybe they can take us down a peg too.
yeah, I can't help wondering, is there not a book in this? Is there not a book in the works around how not to be a terrible version of the masculine? Or you can pick your own title, but is there not a book in the works? Because I just think it would land so well. And there are a lot of people out there, myself included, who are hungry for other idols and aspirations for their boys.
So just between you, me, and the microphone, and whoever listens to this, I did sign with a literary agent in the summer. I am working on an outline. Um, yeah, there's a book in the works. How quickly will it get out there? Well, um, you know, if the baby lets me sleep sooner rather than later. I'm not gonna lie. I'm pretty much at my limit right now with what I can handle, but there is something in the works.
Well, thank you for making the time to talk to me then.
Well, thank you for having me. It's also just nice sometimes to have the ability to sit down and talk to grown-ups. That's good too.
Fun once in a while when they're not trolling you on the internet, right?